So hello and welcome to the question period, everyone. I'd like to welcome Jack Payne. And if you have any questions, you can unmute your mic, and that prompt is found in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And please ask Jack some questions regarding his presentation and soil salinity in general. So Jack, I've got a question for you.
Sure.
Has there been any tech means to reduce salinity, such as pumping down groundwater or using electrodes to attract the salts in the soil to specific locations that are excavated?
That's a good question, Brad. I think there's a lot more that could be done. I think with some of the groundwater flows, the aquifers, and some of the shallow water tables. Of course, some of the situation we get into, though, is when you start dealing with aquifers and groundwater. Now you're getting into the realm of sort of the public domain and Alberta environment. So drainage and tile drainage is certainly and has been proven to be, pardon me, an alternative. It gets into that whole realm then of who owns the water, where does the water go, those sorts of things, and you get into a lot of ramifications about that, which I'm not an expert on. So it's certainly a tool that has been used. It can be effective, but where you go with that water is the situation. And again, the quality of the water, because if it is especially shallow water tables tend to be water that's highly contaminated, maybe not the best for alternative uses. So that is something that is a concern as well.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Jack.
Hi, Jack. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for that very informative presentation that you gave. My name is Daniel, and I'm a professional agrologist joining from Vancouver Island in British Columbia. And
welcome.
It's great. Yeah, it's great to hear the perspective from fellow professional agrologists and soil scientists from other provinces too. And I've worked careers in Ontario and spent some time in Alberta, and now I'm in BC. And I was wondering if you could address something that I don't think is too much of an issue in Alberta. Just wondering if you had any commentary regarding farming along coastal environments. So again, not usually an issue in Alberta. But there's been several instances where I've been on agricultural parcels on, for example, the Gulf Islands, and a very unique challenges faced by some farmers because of proximity of agricultural parcels to coastlines. And there's been instances where literally the plan for crop cultivation has been within maybe 15, 20 meters away from the coastline of the bay. Any perspectives from your career on how farmers can manage issues related to salinity from working close to the coasts, if you have any experience with that?
Well, I'd like to have had experience with it, but unfortunately, I've been landlocked my entire career, Daniel. So I can't speak to that. I guess having had some interaction with agronomists in British Columbia, though, as you get into the coastal areas, shallow and water quality again is a huge issue. And I know particularly in those areas where you've got shallower groundwater in proximity to livestock operations, there's been concerns about water contamination, through manure and seepage and that kind of thing. I honestly can't speak to the situation if it would be managing salts, next to a coastline. I haven't had any experience with that, unfortunately. So sorry, I can't really ante up any suggestions there.
Oh, no need to apologize, Jack.
Okay.
It's a very unique problem, and I've been trying to speak to professionals regarding this, and it seems to be a very niche issue. Because,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah, and if there's anything, any developed, well-developed management strategies, I'd love to reach out to you in the near future to further discuss, to see what your thoughts might be.
Right, right. No, that would I'd be all ears. It would be interesting to kind of deal with that, and also, I guess, to explore, I guess, what soil chemistry and salts you're dealing with. I mean, what type of salt predominantly would we be dealing with? That also gives you some clues as possibly the management. So that would be, yeah, would be interesting to learn more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And if anyone has any questions for Jack, you can simply unmute your mic, which is found in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, or type into your questions into the chat box.
Hey, Jack. This is Uwe Kurt calling, an agronomist as well. How are you?
Good.
Great. I just have a question. I don't know if you have any experience or if you can comment on the using machinery to determine texture. I believe it's based on soil, salinity as well. EM38 or the various machines. If you can comment a little bit on that based on your experience.
Well, the EM38, originally was not even designed for agricultural purposes. It was actually designed for use for mining and for exploration. It was discovered that using that instrument, you could get some assessment of other soil quality parameters and things like that in terms of, for example, electrical conductivity and even texture. So there's been a lot of mapping that has been done with some of these instruments. And again, if you're using an EM38, it's providing raw readings. It basically, the premise of the unit is it transmits an electromagnetic signal through the soil. Some of that signal then is reflected back to the instrument. And so, what it's measuring is what is transmitted into the soil and then what is reflected back. And it's able to give you a numerical or a value reading of what it's sensing in the difference between what's transmitted and what comes back. And of course, then that can be correlated back towards soil quality parameters like texture and like salinity. That's why when you're working with an EM38, you need to have soil test information to correlate what's actually happening, because it's just sending you numbers, and you need to be able to calibrate the instrument to tell you what's happening. So, low readings versus high readings. Well, typically what we associate is when we're starting to get high readings with an EM38, that could be an indication of higher clay content, and as well, it could also be an indication of higher salt content. But the instrument has to be calibrated to be able to translate that information into values as to what to relate to in terms of either increased EC or increased clay content or soil texture. So without calibration, you're just getting raw numbers. And the other aspect of an EM38 is, and having worked with Dr. Shelley Woods for several years when we were doing this, also found out that EM38 readings in frozen soils are highly unreliable. The error is much greater, and we've learned basically not to trust the EM38 readings that are coming from frozen soils. So you pretty much have to limit your assessments to spring through the summer and prior to freeze up. But important to have the instrument calibrated, otherwise the numbers can be erroneous. So it's a very effective unit once you got it calibrated, because you can hook it up to a data logger, you've got GPS, and so you can create real-time maps across the landscape without taking multiple soil samples once it's calibrated. And it's a very powerful tool for assessing what I call the invisible salinity, because one of the limitations with soil sampling is, of course, you're only taking, assessments from where you've pulled cores from, and you certainly can't do that across the entire field. So an EM38 is a very, very powerful tool for doing mapping to assess the overall condition of the entire field and where these other areas are. So it's a great tool.
Perfect. Thanks for your comments.
Thanks, Uwe.
And Jack, I just got an email from Todd Green, and he said it was the best salinity talk he's heard so far.
Oh my gosh. Thank you.
Absolutely fantastic. Hello, everyone. And if you have any questions for Jack, you can unmute your mic, which is found in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, or you can type your questions into the chat bar and I can read them to Jack. Thank you for watching the presentation today and for attending this session. So Jack, I have a question for you. Have you participated in any situations in which a farmer has installed tile drainage and it hasn't worked well for him, such as it expands salinity problem or perhaps just moves it to a different location?
To be honest, Brad, haven't had a situation like that. Any of the projects that I was involved with Alberta Agriculture, where we did tile drainage, they worked quite well. The results were quite striking. Now, where things did go off the rails, of course, with tile drainage is over time, is if the tile starts to get plugged and clogged and starts to no longer function. And that was a situation that I saw in a few areas of the Lethbridge Irrigation District, where they had installed some tile drainage. Things worked great. And then over a number of years, the tiles became clogged and no longer functioned. And I guess that's a thing to remember is we can't, when we deal with salinity, it's going to still be an ongoing process. It isn't like, you've done something and you've cured it and now it's no longer an issue. If you've still got groundwater flow, if you still got shallow water flowing in, and you're managing it, yes. But if it's still a source of water and salts, once you remove your control or your mitigation strategy, it's going to continue to develop. So yes, in some of those situations, things were under control for a period of 5, 6, 7 years. And then all of a sudden there was a situation where they were going back going, what's going on here? The ground is starting to get saturated again. Again, lo and behold, they dug up the tile and found out it had been plugged. So, that's no different than with our vegetative controls, right? If you put in deep-rooted forages, alfalfa, it's going to have a finite lifespan, maybe 5 to 8 years. And then you're going to have to take that forage out and rejuvenate it or, go back into annual cropping. So again, got to remember that, you put that into forage for maybe 5 to 6 years. You dealt with the issue, the salt problem seemed to kind of go away. Got to remember, you haven't cured it completely. It's going to be an ongoing process, which may come back again, which would mean after a few years, you might have to, reseed if you're using vegetative controls to seed them back in again. So hope that kind of addresses that.
Yes, thank you, Jack. And I don't want to hog the question period, but I've seen a few quarter sections actually converted to subsurface drip irrigation. What implications does that have for soil salinity?
How would I put it, Brad? I guess it's part of the ecology and the hydrology together, because I view these go together, and it's almost the same situation, I guess, with irrigation. For example, if you install a pivot on an area that is perhaps the predominant recharge area of a saline area downslope, let's say, you're putting on additional water that maybe was never, how would I say, you've increased the seasonal precipitation in essence is what you've done. And it is quite possible that an irrigation system, if you over irrigate, it could lead to recharge going into the groundwater. So not only just, I guess, from the canals, which have been pretty much mitigated, but yeah, when you're adding irrigation, whether it be drip irrigation or a pivot or something, you're actually putting water on top of the normal seasonal precipitation, and you better make sure that the vegetation is able to use it so that there's not a lot of leaching occurring. So it gets into a bit of a complex scenario, and so it's all about maintaining a balance, maintaining a proper balance of the water that's available to what the crop can use. And I guess that's one of the things I didn't mention in my presentation because I was going over time. But when you think about perennial forages, trees, shrubs, whatever, if you think about the period of water use, forages will tend to start using water early May, June, July, August, and a good portion of September. So basically, those forages, those perennials, are using water for about 5 months of the growing season, or effectively the whole growing season. When you think about when we switch to annual cropping systems like cereals, canola, in terms of overall water use, peak water use for those crops isn't attained until you start getting into June, July, and then by August, those crops are senescing and water use falls off dramatically. So what we've done then too is we've replaced the native vegetation with, instead of something that's using water for 4 to 5 months of the year, to maybe a crop that's only using effectively the water for 3 months of the growing season. And so on either side, in the early spring or in the late fall, if you get heavy precipitation, there's nothing there to utilize that moisture, and that can build up the water table because you got excess water that's not being used, which can leach, to the groundwater.
Oh, thank you very much, Jack. And if anyone has any questions for Jack, you can unmute your mic, which is found in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Alternatively, you can type your questions into the chat bar. Jack, I have one more question. Do farmers ever install a groundwater well and begin pumping out of that well as a means to regulate the groundwater flow into an area to combat salinity?
That's an interesting point. We've run across that a couple of times, and we've had producers who have asked that same question, can I tap into that and use it to fill a dugout, that sort of thing. To be honest, that gets past my area of expertise, because now you're really getting into hydrogeology and flow rates and how much water would come out and that sort of thing. And and again, it would really hinge on water quality. Some of the water that comes from those shallow aquifers, is decent water, can be used. For example, like you say, the project they did at Swift Current, they were able to use that groundwater to irrigate, shelter belts. It all hinges on water quality, because if it is strongly saline water, now you've created a direct route to the surface by installing that well, and now you're going to have to deal with it. So it's kind of like opening up the floodgates, literally. Once you drill into that and create a well, now you've opened the door, a Pandora's box, so to speak. And if the water quality is extremely poor, there's no sense filling up a dugout with that. And then I guess the other situation is, what is the flow and how much will be coming, and will you be able to keep it contained? Because once you get to a situation where perhaps your containment structure, your dugout, becomes filled, Now, if it starts to flow overland, where's that water going to go? And are you going to create, and it's possible to create surface salinity through that as well, because if there are dissolved salts in that water, flows across the surface, it evaporates, leaves the salts behind, and you may create surface salinity, through that. So it's one that would require a lot of planning. It would require a lot of planning, and usually what happens is afterwards the idea is sometimes is dropped because it's more work than what they were expecting to do. But when we were doing salinity work back in the 80s and 90s, we drilled a lot of water table wells in order to study the hydrogeology and the depth of the water table. One of the things that had to be done was we had to decommission those wells properly as well. So you plug them in. So a lot of, if you don't follow the proper procedure to decommission a well and plug it up, again, what you've done is you've opened up a fissure basically to the soil surface where that water could flow. So something it has to be done carefully.
Very good points, Jack. And if anyone has questions for Jack, you can unmute your mic and join the conversation, or you can type your questions into the chat bar. And I noticed that Deanna Matson had a question for you, Jack. Have you dealt with any situations where excess manure application has caused salinity issues? And if so, how is the situation dealt with or mitigated?
Yes, manure has salt in it. And I've had some situations where I was called out to do some diagnostics. I said, what's going on with these areas of the field that are not producing? And sure enough, when we started soil sampling, some of those areas we found, again, some high salt content, as well as high nutrient content. So that's usually the giveaway that you understand where it's coming from manure, is because you've got high nutrient content as well. The one thing with these situations where you've got a saline situation caused by manure is if it's a situation where you don't have a high water table. In other words, there's no groundwater pushing up, bringing salts up, which means you've got drainage. If you've got the capability of the well-drained soil, in other words, you can have a net downward movement of water instead of upwards. With manured soils where you've got a salt problem, time will heal that, because if you've got heavy precipitation, or if it happens to be an irrigated field that is well drained, by applying irrigation water, you're going to be able to flush those salts downwards. So in those situations, that can be mitigated over time, because eventually you will get sufficient rainfall or irrigation that will push the salts down. So when you've got a net downward movement of water, that will cure itself eventually. Yes, they will become diluted. The thing I wanted to point out, I guess, too, is when we take soil samples and we're looking at, let's say, at the EC at different depths of the soil, you got to remember when you do a soil test, that's a snapshot in time. That was that particular situation, let's say on May 1st of that year, at that particular point in time. A lot of things happen immediately afterwards that could change that. So again, it's not static. It's not going to stay there forever. And so one of the things I learned in the years that I spent with Alberta agriculture was that salts are dynamic. They move up and down in the profile. They'll move up when you've got periods of evaporation and dry conditions. You get some periods of significant rainfall. You may see them the salts pushed back downwards. And we see that a lot in central Alberta. We'll see a lot of, in April, early April, mid-April, you'll see a lot of white crusting on the soil surface if it's been dry, because you've got a lot of evaporation occurring, the soils are warming up. And then you start getting into May and June when you start getting rainfall events, and you'll notice some of those areas that were white, that were showing up the soil salinity, they disappear, because what's happened is you've had enough precipitation that has been able to push some of those salts down, and the crusting goes away. So it is important to remember that salts are dynamic and they can move up and down in the profile.
Thank you, Jack. Would anyone have any other questions for Jack? You can unmute your mic, or you can type your questions into the chat bar. Jack, I've got a question for you. So is it pretty typical for producers just to plant alfalfa within that salinity area? Or what's generally the most used technique?
Well, often we get pushback from growers about planting forages around some of those saline areas because typically those areas don't line up well with field boundaries or the way they're working. And so then they go like, well, if we do this, now I have to work around this area. So that's usually one thought of a bit of pushback. So what we try to do is say, you know what, try and square off a portion of the field, so that we're not going to do a patchwork quilt of control, no control sort of thing. And again, it makes it much easier if you're going to put in forages to have enough acres that it's worth the time to harvest it. So, we kind of encourage growers to do that. When we look at forages, there's a lot of comments about, with alfalfa, and I kind of oversimplified it on my diagram saying, plant salt tolerant forages here and alfalfa, as an interceptor or a recharge crop. Sometimes it's a little gray as to where is that transition? Where do I stop with alfalfa and where do I begin with the salt tolerant forage? And so that's why in some of those recommendations, we say, you know what, include some alfalfa through with the entire mix. And you know what, let Mother Nature sort out where it's too saline for the alfalfa to grow and where the salt tolerant forages can take over, rather than trying to get so specific that you define boundaries, where you would say this is where the salt tolerant grass starts and this is where the alfalfa ends. So that's certainly another approach that you can look at. And then once you get far enough away from that discharge area where there's no problem with salinity, then you could go with a predominant, a pure alfalfa stand, so to speak. But yeah, it's always a bit of a crapshoot trying to define where is the cutoff line, where do I start with my salt tolerant grasses and where do I begin with a pure stand of alfalfa. As I say, for that discharge area, maybe that's why you include a pound or two of alfalfa in there. The areas that are too saline, the alfalfa doesn't grow, but the salt tolerant grasses do. And let Mother Nature sort out, what will be adapted to what areas.
Thank you, Jack. And I have a question from Jordan Miller. And he asks, what are the best salt-tolerant shelter belt options?
Russian olive is about one of the more salt-tolerant trees. Yeah, when we start getting into shelter belts, there's not a lot of good options. Again, it depends on the degree of salinity that's in the soil. Certainly willows and any of your poplar species use a lot of water. They colonize very rapidly, but again, they're not, how to say, really salt tolerant species themselves. But once you've got the salt kind of, the saline areas kind of mitigated or under control, then you can perhaps establish them in there because again, it really is willows and poplars around some of those potholes that help retain the water within the pothole and prevent it from flowing outwards and acting as a seep. So I'm not a real horticultural tree person other than say Russian olive, and that's about it, I think, in terms of what I know offhand on that. Sorry, I can't speak to that one better in a little more better terms.
Thank you, Jack. And if anyone has any questions for Jack, just unmute your mic and join the conversation, or you can type your questions into the chat bar. Jack, I've got a question. Does soil salinity affect the efficacy of any herbicides?
Good question. really hasn't been something that's been looked at. In terms of products, and when we start, I guess if you're looking at efficacy, in other words, in terms, so are you talking about reducing efficacy or contributing to carryover issues, Brad?
I guess reducing efficacy. Yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, there's no known effects that we know of in terms of the chemistry part, I guess, that would influence any of the soil active herbicides. You know, in terms of if you were applying any kind of a herbicide to areas of, let's say we're talking about invisible salinity, where perhaps you've got the crops somewhat stressed due to the influence of the salt. Now, when we think about that, really, again, saline soils basically cause the same sort of stress on a plant as basically drought, because the salts are impeding the uptake of water and nutrients into the plant. And so essentially what you're seeing are symptoms of drought, even though you've got adequate moisture in the soil due to the salt content. So I would guess there would be some effect, negative effect, on possibly control of some weeds or whatever, because again, you know, a lot of herbicides say apply to weeds when they're actively growing, when you've got good growing conditions. And we know that some herbicides that affect the growing points of the weeds can, you know, have some adverse effect on efficacy because the plant is not actively growing. So I suppose it's something that's never really been studied, but, you know, could be an underlying situation where it could influence, I guess, efficacy, because again, it's mimicking drought stress, and certain products, weed control products, herbicides, that where that kind of stress would reduce the actively growing weed, it could possibly, yeah. It's a good point, and something we've never ever addressed or looked at, but it's certainly a good point, Brad, to bring up. Yeah.
Thanks, Jack.
You know, I guess while we're talking about this, Brad, I didn't get a chance to mention this, but when we were talking in the section on the presentation about salt tolerance of crops, going back to the work that was done at Swift Current with Harold Steffoon, I didn't elaborate on it because of time in the presentation, but going back to the classes of wheat, like when he did their study in the late 90s, early 2000s, he looked at basically your four major classes of wheat. He was looking at hard red spring versus durum versus a soft wheat versus a Canada Prairie spring. And what they found in the data, this was what really I found interesting, was that at an EC of 2, and EC of 2 would be, you know, categorized as non-saline to just slightly saline soil. Actually, in the work that they did, they found a 15 to 20% yield reduction in prairie spring and hard red spring wheat at an EC of 2. Durum and soft wheat were basically unaffected. And by the time they got to an EC of 4 in their experiments, you were seeing up to a 40% yield reduction in hard red spring and CPS wheat, which was really significant. And then durum and soft wheat was only taking like about a 10 to 15% yield reduction. So that was where the concern about invisible salinity came in, that invisible salinity is certainly less than an EC of 4. You would not see crusting on a field. You might not even say a soil test is saying it's an EC of 2. Well, that's not considered a saline soil. And yet the grower is going like, you know, why is my wheat only yielding 40 bushels an acre when the neighbor is getting 50 or 55? That's the realization that they came into in terms of their figures, that invisible salinity could be causing a lot of unaccounted for yield reduction. And in my experience, when I was working with growers, and that was why we were doing 2-depth soil sampling, I would get growers that would come to me and say, this field just isn't yielding very well. It just doesn't seem to do well. I've tried fungicides, I've tried micronutrients, I've tried this, I've tried that. I can't seem to figure out why I just don't get a great yield on this field. And so when I looked at their soil tests, they'd only sampled 0 to 6 inch depth. And I said, can we sample the field and have a look at it? And they said, sure, go ahead. Well, what we were finding was, again, when we did two-depth sampling, we were finding salts in that subsoil, and again, the salts move up and down, and probably the situation we pinpointed was invisible salinity, which is why this field just wasn't doing very well. It wasn't a train wreck, it wasn't an absolute disaster, but it was just the grower was just saying, you know, the expected yield just doesn't perform, and that's where invisible salinity was kind of pegged as the culprit.
Very interesting, Jack. If anyone has any questions for Jack, please unmute your mic and join the conversation, or type your questions into the chat bar. Jack, it looks like it's quite quiet in the audience. I'll give it a few more minutes. And if anyone has any questions, please unmute your mic or type your questions into the chat bar, and Jack will answer them.
Maybe we've done a good job of solving all the problems, Brad.
Yes, let's hope. Also, if anyone has any feedback about the presentation, the platform, or has any questions about the use of the platform, don't hesitate to ask those as well. Jack, in your presentation, there was you mentioned that there's no soil amendment that can bind to the soil salinity. I guess what's been marketed in the past? Has there been a few options available that just don't deliver?
Yeah, there's some products that have been around. One that comes to mind is lime or gypsum, and again, where this came from with the gypsum is that in the oil patch, when they're drilling for oil, they'll hit, you know, groundwater, but some of the groundwater they hit are from very, very deep aquifers. You know, we're not talking about the same sort of situation we've got with our soil salinity, and they'll have a brine spill. In other words, salt water spill around the well. Well, actually, most of the brine spills that they have are actually chloride salts, not sulfate salts. And so using gypsum can be effective because, again, it can knock the salts off of binding to the soil particle. And then again, typically around an oil well, you don't have a high water table. You've got, you know, typically it's in an area where you've got downward flow of water. And so salts will naturally leach away. They'll, you know, over time, they'll leach themselves down. There's been a lot of other products that claim to amend soil salinity. But again, unless you can physically remove the salt from the soil, there's no agent that will neutralize it. There's, you know, as many claims have been made about products that help with soil compaction. They'll help with, you know, getting rid of this of the salt. There's nothing known that has done that. So if there's any claims made to it, they're false. There are products out there that maybe, you know, can be applied that, you know, they'll say helps with stress, helps plants overcome stress, that sort of thing. There may be something to those, but again, the cause of the problem is excess salt in the soil. So unless, again, you can remove that salt, there's really nothing else that can be done. So any claims of products that are miracle cures, and we've had situations like that where a claim has been made, they applied something, and by coincidence, the spring that they applied this product, they got heavy rainfall. Well, what happened was basically it was the rainfall that leached the salts downward, moved them out of the out of the seed bank, out of the seed row, and things started to germinate. And they say, hey, look, we applied this, and look, your saline area is much better. Well, that's just really a coincidence that we had maybe heavy rainfall. So I always tie that back into it. If somebody's applied something, I say, so what was your precipitation like? You know, did you, after application, did you have a situation where you had heavy precipitation afterwards? And that's probably more what was the what cured, well, not cured, but mitigated the problem temporarily. Because again, it would only be temporary because, again, if it is a saline area that's got an net upward movement of water, those salts are going to come back up. So until you can get the groundwater downward movement of water, the hydraulic pressure and the capillary rise and evapotranspiration will continue to move salts upward into the into the root zone.
Thank you, Jack. And I have one final question from Jordan Miller. He asks, we have a field bordering a highway that is causing saline issues from the road runoff. Obviously, we can't address the recharge area. Would seeding a buffer crop comprised of alfalfa and grass along the highway be the best option?
That's a good point, and I'm glad he brought that up about roads and highways. Sometimes, I mean, our infrastructure of roads, they run basically across country, regardless of topography. And so, yes, roads can, we have seen where they can cause some problems with the natural drainage of, especially the hydrology. So, that road bed extends below the surface. I mean, you've built up the road bed below the surface. So that can impede the flow of some water and groundwater and can act as a bit of a barrier and a bit of a dam to create a situation. So yes, in situations like that, again, using forages to try and dry up the excess water is good. And again, picking a variety of alfalfa, again, I don't want to get into it too much, but when you are choosing an alfalfa, try and choose a variety that's tap-rooted and has moderate salt tolerance. And there are a few varieties out there, for example, like Barricade, that does have, a decent amount of salt tolerance and is tap-rooted. That's the other thing I should have mentioned. There are some creeping varieties of alfalfa. They're okay, but what we really want to do is try and use up as much water as deep as we can. So that's why a tap-rooted variety would be more preferable to use.
Thank you, Jack. And I'd like to thank you for your presentation today and also for the question and answer session. I think that's everyone for questions. If you have any follow-up questions for Jack, please don't hesitate to either send them to him directly, or you can send them to me and I can forward that over to Jack. But thanks everyone for attending the session today and of course for attending the series. And thanks again, Jack, for coming.
Thanks, Brad. Thank you for the invite to be part of the program.
All right, I'll end the question and answer session now. And thanks again, everyone.